how do you handle an artistic estate? John and I had never, ever talked about what to do with his art or the notebooks he had or anything related to his art after he died. Most artistic estates, they're either these mega artists like Donald Judd or Warhol, or, or Rauschenberg, and they have an enormous machine behind them. But, there are lots of artists who die, and the people who are left are like, what do I do with this, So who was John Wilcox? Well, he was my brother. He was an artist, a very caring individual, a complex individual, and a very sensitive soul.
So John Wilcox was a painter who lived most of his life in Texas.
He had this aura about him in the way he just looked at you or was with you.
I always thought of John as a work of art, and then all the things that he looked at and touched became works of art also.
John was a lot of fun and very, very bright. Yeah, I had kind of a wild streak in him sometimes too, and I think that helped him live his life.
Every single work of art kind of has this obsessive quality to it, or this really complicated working history in it. And I think that's definitely John, and definitely special to kind of his method.
I mean, who was he for me? Of course. Well, he was a friend. A wonderful, sublime painter.
Who was interested in making work that actually expressed his own state of mind and his struggles and his ideas, both with his sexual identity and then eventually with issues of health.
My name is John Wilcox. I'm an artist. I lived in New York City from 1985 to 1989. My work started when I was a young child, I think trying to put meaning together in my life, especially sort of the idea of my male and female side, and trying to explore.
Well, I met John Wilcox many, many years ago when I was the director of the Dallas Museum of Art, and I was interested in having a really powerful relationship with the community of artists in Dallas, rather than ignoring that community like many art museums do. And I met John through a whole group of other artists who were kind of helping me make a list of the most committed and intelligent and high quality artists, and John was one of them. When John died, David was very concerned about reaching out to other people to help him figure out, what to do in the absence of John himself.
The idea came to exhibit his work, and then we started really getting more focused on that with different curators involved.
After John's death in 2012, his loft and studio were transformed into the Wilcox space, a site for the documentation, exhibition, and study of the work he left behind. From 2013 to 2018, the Wilcox space hosted 6 curated exhibitions in partnership with the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at the University of Texas at Dallas.
I don't think anyone, including David and including me, at the beginning of it realized the range and depth of John's work, because of course, you don't actually see the work of an artist while the artist is alive, because you only see what's shown at a gallery or what happens to be sold, and John wasn't so interested in the art market, and there were a few shows, but we didn't actually know John until the space came into being. And the John Wilcox that's been revealed in the space is a much more complex artist, much more intelligent artist than we thought.
Since John's death in 2012, over 350 artworks have been preserved and cataloged by his brother David. Without these efforts, most of the works would have remained completely unseen.
The work is this kind of odd combination of deeply personal and apparently impersonal when you look at it. And this dichotomy, I think, it makes it all the more relevant for contemporary art, because we associate minimalism and works of art that are rather simple, at least initially, with a kind of aesthetic that's really not about emotional depth or struggles. And the fact that John's art succeeds in both ways, both as apparently cool and apparently uninvolved with emotional aspects of the world. And then as you plummet it and get to know about the mark makings and the words and the reasons for his doing things, you begin to understand that it too is an art which has as much emotional depth as any works by Van Gogh or Delacroix.
John explored complex themes in his work, skillfully reducing them to minimalist expressions. In Drain, a painting that John created in 1988 at the height of the AIDS epidemic, we're presented with 2 canvases, covered in various colors, then sanded. The top canvas has brushstrokes flowing in a horizontal direction, much like a pool of water in a sink, while the brushstrokes in the bottom canvas flow with a downward motion, as if down a drain. The visual metaphor was a way for John to address the lives that were indiscriminately wasted, as well as a way to reference the health complications this disease caused, a literal draining force of energy and life. This sophisticated and multi-layered approach to minimalism characterized John as a painter.
I kept finding a tension between the rigorous and the mathematical and the precise on one hand, and on the other hand, this sense of the made and the irregular. And so I think throughout his work, there are 2 things going on, the kind of plan and the design, and then the execution.
You're really letting go of certain authorship when you're making certain kind of process-based work, because it's the process that's guiding you, and there's an opportunity for artists to sort of step back and allow the work to make itself. John's paintings really straddle that, I think, because yes, there is this involvement of doing one thing over and over, but because of the personal nature of all of his work and the titles in general, it infuses what could be seen as just straight process abstraction with a really specific narrative that's outside of the material.
Although John's work was admired by curators and collectors, he was incredibly reclusive and relatively unknown outside of that small circle. One of the few friends John kept in touch with was James McGee, the artist known for his masterwork, The Hill. It is a complex of buildings and sculptures located near El Paso, Texas, that is simultaneously art, architecture, performance, and poetry.
How long did I know John for? We'll say 92, 93 till the time he died. our friendship deepened during the course of that time. It began for a year or two just simply phone calls. And eventually I met him, and the friendship continued. And he was absolutely unique in every way. I think we both, in our own particular ways, we were committed to making things. And we were roughly the same age. We were both gay. We both were dealing with similar health issues. There were just some common connections that we shared. But above that, he was very, very gentle. And that was apparent from the beginning. And it was very welcoming. He was, in some ways, he was like a monk. I know he spent a great deal of time on one picture, usually, on any given picture. It was meditative, and that's why I would say he was sort of like a monk. There's one that is an utter masterpiece, and like Barry Whistler, I don't know whether he has sold it, but it's a utter masterpiece, and it's yellow. And it has a pattern, or several patterns and rhythm. It is sublime. It's as good as it gets in terms of abstract, meditative, contemplative. And like I said, he was unique. I knew right from the beginning, just by his voice, he was unique.
I think the further along I've gotten with my work, the more it seems natural, like it's coming out of me, but also when I look back at work, I'm just amazed by what I was able to do, and like there really is some kind of force behind us that is working itself out through us.
One of the other things that I was so taken with when I first started to get to know John's work was that not only would he incorporate found objects like postage stamps or luggage stickers into these sketchbooks or artists' books, really they became, but he would also adapt motifs or shapes, distill it from the world and distill them down into their kind of geometric purity. And in fact, the painting that I'm sitting in front of is called Cell Tower, and it's based on a cell tower that's right on 75, driving north from Dallas on the way to Denison, on the way to the lake house, that he would see every weekend. And we found among his ephemera drawing after drawing after drawing of this shape, getting it just right with the tower itself and the guidelines. And so there's a way in which he would take shapes or actual objects from the world and work with them or recontextualize them or essentialize them and make you see those things anew.
Yeah, these were going to be pieces about transformer towers and cell phone towers and TV towers. They're all reaching up to the sky. I sort of like that. They seem like they're sort of little, totem gods or something throughout our landscape.
I just love to think about how this kind of experience of kind of going out in the Texas landscape and seeing these kind of industrial and mechanical structures, thousands of, millions of people have had that experience. But John, being the artist that he was, translated it into these very distinctive kind of simplified, you could almost call them totemic, slightly mysterious looking shapes that, contrary to so much of modern art and the way people think about modern art, I feel that the artist's life and biography is just essential. It's just something that you can't not care about and can't not want to know about.
This whole area is built upon Cretaceous shale and limestone, and so as kids out here at the lake, we would invariably be down on the shore, up on the cliffs, and hunting fossils, a lot of nautilus, a lot of sea urchins, and things like that, which, if you can imagine, for a young child was pretty exciting. And so John and I grew up in a world where when you're outside, you're sort of looking for things. We developed a real sensitivity to what's outside of your own world and what's in nature. I think one of the unique aspects of John was his amazing perception of the world. He could see things that were very nuanced and unusual that other people might absolutely miss. I was the youngest of the two of us, and John was always interested in art, interested in visual things. He drew all the time.
From an early age, John was quiet, sensitive, and immensely gifted, both academically and artistically. His parents decided to send him to a boarding school in Austin, where he nurtured his interest in the arts and graduated with the highest academic standing his senior year.
So I seriously started painting when I was in high school, just a elective course in painting, and that really sort of changed my world.
After studying art at Colorado College, John was accepted to the prestigious Pomona College Master of Fine Arts program. However, upon visiting in 1977, he instinctively felt the university was not right for him and returned to Texas seeking professional experience in a museum setting. Here, John would meet his friend and future gallerist, Barry Whistler.
I'm Barry Whistler. I have Barry Whistler Gallery here in Dallas, Texas. In the gallery, I represent the work of John. I think the first show we did was in 86, 87, somewhere right in there. And we still represent the work today, working with David. I first met John in Fort Worth at the Modern Art Museum in Fort Worth. He had sent in a letter to volunteer for a job, and so we decided that was a good fit for the museum. But there was a lot of great things going on there. I had found this catalog recently, this Stella since 1970, and realized that in March of 1978 is when this show opened, and that John would have come right before that opened, so there was a dynamic energy. I mean, Frank Stella was there, and I just found out like a few months back that they said, oh yeah, Ed Ruscha designed this catalog. I was like, what? That probably means Ed Ruscha was there at the opening, this was going on, that was going on. Anyway, I mean, for John to be the mailroom clerk, and all this is going out in the front, and he'd be able to get included in some of it. It was an exciting time.
So in some ways, that experience from Fort Worth, John was in an environment where he was immersed in contemporary art in a very organic way. There's a notebook entry in one of his notebooks where he mentions, he just has one cryptic little statement: the night I bought Frank Stella a beer.
Energized by his experience working at the museum, John committed his efforts to becoming an artist. In 1980, John painted Atomic Thunderbird, a work inspired by Native American mythology, where the thunderbird is both revered for bringing rain, as well as feared for creating thunder. John expressed this duality in a hybrid shape that depicts a bird as well as a symbol for radiation. Even the meticulous technique of applying paint with fractured brushstrokes reverberates across the surface like atomic particles, furthering this narrative. This painting contains many of the themes that John would continue to examine throughout his entire career. Through the multiplicity of subject matter, the exploration of technique, and the minimalist approach, John began to define himself as an artist early on with this painting.
I thought it would be interesting to really look about how John began his career as an artist. And so I began to work on the work done in California and New York very early in his career, in this wonderful sort of old abandoned factory in California where John made art outside of the sort of glare of LA and of the LA art scene, but close enough that he could go in and get involved with things and look at things in the way that he did. So I started with the kind of wonky California things, which in his whole oeuvre are the most, or the wittiest, and the most full of color and life and kind of juicy paint. And they were a complete surprise to people who thought they knew John, because almost nobody who knew John knew where John came from, aesthetically, as an artist.
The year John was in California would be one of the most prolific of his career. Staying at a ranch in a remote area of Carpinteria, the self-imposed isolation gave John the space and time he needed to set aside the self-doubt and frustrations he struggled with. He completed about one canvas a month during this productive time. Open book bat, painted in 1981, is an example of the techniques John was working with in California. The canvas is highly textured and the background is semi-metallic. The black shape is a cutout piece of paper gessoed to the canvas with a tiny hint of rainbow material still visible. As for the imagery itself, John plays on sort of a gestalt duality. Is it a book or is it a bat? Or is it both? Or could he be referring to himself as an open book?
You know, I think going to California was part of coming out. It took a while. And that's just kind of how it was back then.
In 1985, John moved to New York and lived with friends Joe Fabish and his partner Tommy Jones, owners of Fabish Gallery. Here he set up a small studio in his loft and began a new body of work.
When he was in New York, John really focused on these enormously large canvases that were composed of an infinite number of points of color, dots of paint. And those works are deceptive in a way because from a distance they look simply like a color field, and yet when you move closer to them, you notice the incredible number of points of color and dots of paint that he applied to them.
John was as equally interested in the mediums and techniques he was using as he was with the conceptual narrative. In this body of work, John is creating a dynamic tension between the part and the whole, between simplicity and complexity. These works remind us of how the infinite embraces the finite, and how the simple is composed of the complex. John's pointillist works can also serve as a metaphor for our lives, each stroke of paint symbolizing a single moment, an attempt, or a day. Each one seemingly insignificant on its own, but together creating the masterpiece of our lives.
I lived in New York City from 1985 to 1989, 90, and during the last part of my stay there, I did some paintings, 3 paintings that were kind of quiet memorial to all the AIDS and HIV that I was seeing happening in New York. Just thinking about how many people that were just going by the wayside so fast, and kind of that whole paranoia and angst that grew up out of that, and anger, but with my compulsive, obsessive, meditative ways, I made little marks over and over on these canvases, little washes of different colors over and over each other, and like counting time or counting lives, or marking time, wasting time, making time, killing time. And then I kind of sanded these surfaces down where they're still pretty colorful, but they're very subdued and distressed, and almost like erased, like so many people's lives.
Coincident with his time in New York, he also started doing word drawings. He would meticulously print on paper and then might apply a number of techniques to them, sometimes sanding them. Initially, those word drawings were constructed as colophons, if you will, to paintings that he had done.
He would choose words and put them together and make you look at them both as kind of formal entities, but also as sounds. And so I always find myself speaking his word drawings and thinking about how they sound and how those sounds play with each other.
John had learned calligraphy when he was in Colorado College and had spent a period of time with a group of monks in which he would practice Roman calligraphy 6 to 8 hours a day. It not only gave him amazing, if you will, fine motor skills in creating the calligraphy, but it engendered a kind of meticulous devotion to process and to details. And you can see that in these word drawings. The other thing you see in them is his incredible playfulness with language. The ways in which he would create puns in these word drawings. At first you might not know what he's really talking about, but if you really sat with the phrase, it would become clear what was happening.
Whose Dog Are You is a word drawing John created as a reminder that we are not our own masters as much as we may think. The origin for this piece came after attending a dinner for artist Robert Rauschenberg. Curious about an artwork and how it was made, John asked about a certain technique. Rauschenberg dismissed John's question by responding, "Oh, I have one of my dogs do that," in reference to his studio assistants. Shocked by the comment, John replied back somewhat in jest and somewhat in frustration, "Well, whose dog are you?"
Being gay, living in New York City, being part of the art scene, he knew a number of people who had already died of AIDS. He had a number of friends who were fighting opportunistic infections associated with AIDS. That all radically changed in the late summer of 1989. John noticed that he had these two bilateral growths on his neck and on either side, and he went to his doctor, and it turns out they were benign parotid gland tumors, your parotid glands or your salivary glands. That was good news. The devastating part of it was that in doing the blood workup, they did a Western blot panel to determine if John was carrying antibodies for the HIV virus, and indeed the results showed that he was HIV positive. His body was producing antibodies to the virus. and it was devastating.
I think he was brave in dealing with it the best way he knew how. I think he had a way to get through it with his artwork. I really believe that.
John was channeling through mark making those issues, not illustrating them or being defined by them.
I was really fortunate to have some friends come around at a time that I was kind of out of a very dark period, 13 years, and people really helped me retrain myself and fulfill myself. And you know, each day I feel like we're having more fulfillment, even though sometimes I feel like I'm floating away out to the ocean.
He invited me to go with him on weekends to his lake house, and he had this long table facing a huge bay window facing the lake. So you would sit at this window, he would have his binoculars and his bird book, and we would have coffee and breakfast in the morning and spend an hour just staring at the lake, at the window, at the birds, at nature.
A lot of these pieces he made when he was at the lake house. You see some of these pieces like this. These are things that he saw. I know he saw these on the way to the lake house because these propane tanks are all over the place.
He would use any little items he would find and create something, and, you know, to make him think of the person.
He would usually make additions and send them to a few friends. So this is little pieces of trash blowing across the highway. For some of the meaning behind the collage mail art pieces is that John had yet another opportunity to leave something meaningful behind. And he had an opportunity to make more art.
I just kept, going to this place of making something that I could have a little bit of control over versus life, which don't have much control over.
After moving back to Texas, the gravity of John's diagnosis consumed his thoughts and paved the way for a new body of work. He began to investigate themes of the body, death, and the divine by radically reducing his visual vocabulary to shape, proportion, interval, and a single color.
The two-part and multi-part works that John made were deeply, deeply informed, I think, by, for example, early Christian ivory diptychs or Byzantine polyptychs. But there's also a tradition in modern and contemporary art of multi-part works. There's one diptych in particular called Prayer 2, which consists of two stretched canvases, almost square, but not quite square, placed at a very specific interval. And one of the canvases is slightly, the dimensions of one is slightly smaller than the other. And so it creates this kind of volley between the two in a way that demonstrated for me how a diptych works. It kind of revealed the deep structure of how a viewer engages with a two-part work, volleying back and forth between the two constituent parts.
The way John intended our eyes to travel back and forth between the canvases is a reference to the titles of the works. In Prayer 2, he's in direct dialogue with God through prayer, and it's a back and forth exchange. In Prayer 1, we're presented with a different kind of prayer. The combination of the grid and sequence implies a pattern that is meant to be repeated infinitely. This is a reference to a litany, or any type of prayer meant to be repeated over and over again, such as the Lord's Prayer. John breaks the rule of minimalism that rejects symbolic content. His combination of minimalism with symbolic content makes him a vanguard in this development.
Many artists of this period whose work seems to be very impersonal. There is the famous saying by Andy Warhol saying, "I want to be a machine," and a lot of people take that literally, and you look at their work and you say, it's kind of like a machine made or almost mechanical. And then on the other hand, there's all of the artists whose work is so explicitly and obviously and kind of intensely personal. But I think the way that John's work combines those two things, if you look at it at first, you see immediately that it's in a typically abstract format and so forth, and it's a tangible physical object rather than a kind of illusion using perspective and so on and so forth. On the other hand, especially as you get to know it better, you realize how much of his kind of personal story and personal experience and personal identity is actually there, even if it's not immediately obvious. And so if you're trying to put it in the context of that history, I think the way that John's work combines those two things is pretty unusual and fascinating.
As John's health declined, he was prescribed as many as 20 different medications, resulting in severe insomnia and anxiety. Painting through the sleepless nights, the artwork he created during this time came from a difficult place. John developed a new technique he referred to as pointillist impasto, consisting of the application of small dots of paint to an underlying graphite grid. The meticulous concentration required for these pieces gave him a way to calm his mind. In Buddha Holding Lotus, John simplifies the seated Buddha form, reducing it to the shape of a bell. The bell is a reference to the Buddhist principle of impermanence. Much like the fleeting sound of a bell, so too is our time on this earth impermanent. For John, his deepest struggle was also his path to enlightenment. By relinquishing time through painting, John found peace with the relinquishing of his time here on earth.
The actual points of paint, the small dots, he would use a dowel to apply the paint to the canvas and then let it sit for maybe a half a day or a day and then go back and apply a small indentation. So there's this true dimensionality to the canvas, and when light is shown on it, there's a kind of raking light on each of those points that makes the whole work very luminescent.
One particular painting that's kind of the masterpiece of John's, it's a grid, it's about 5 foot wide and about 6.5 feet tall. It's really sort of made up of dots of yellow paint, but they're about the size of a little smaller than a dime. And they cover this entire field of the painting. And when you look at the background, you see a pencil grid. But when you step back from the painting across the room, you see that it's a few rectangle sort of shapes. He said, well, Barry, that's my bed. That's my pillow. That's my nightstand. That's the floor. You're like, oh my God, this is, and then it had this long title, but the short title is Eternal Rest. And so how he, sees that. I mean, he's living his life and making this painting, and he's still with us. But what is he really looking at? This sort of getting beyond this disease and beyond the body and having this eternal rest. That I think he really thought of, and believed in.
I think the older I got and the tighter I tried to hold on to life, the more kind of controlled the work got. Just, it's simple and it's easy, but there was a long process of getting all the knots out, because there were a lot of knots I tied up, trying to obsess and compulse and control. But it was all good, and like I say, that kind of meditative, repeating of the same thing over and over and over and over and over makes for a nice, meditative kind of frame of mind.
I think there was a lot of iconography related to Christianity.
I mean, I think sometimes with John, you might call it religious, but you could also refer to it as spiritual. And I think he always had that, and I think that was always in there in some kind of a way. And I think sort of seeing to him like a bigger picture of everything.
At the Dallas Museum of Art, painting conservator Laura Hartman is completing the restoration of one of John's pieces, titled Crucifix, a 4-panel work which sustained water damage when the storage room it was housed in flooded during a storm.
So Crucifix is composed of 4 panels, and it's a quite unusual painting in that each panel is composed of different organic materials. So one is made out of mud, the other is made out of sawdust, one is made out of the ash from burning the sawdust, and the last one is made by adhering a cloth to a canvas support. And when you hang it, it forms a crucifix, and it's really beautiful, but treating sawdust and ash and mud is not an easy task for a conservator.
Because John's technique for this particular work was undocumented, Laura had to completely reverse engineer the process. Before any restoration could start, she created various samples, each with different techniques, and compared the microscopic surfaces until a match was found.
I was talking to a curator that used to work at the DMA named Gabe Ritter, and I remember I was showing him the sawdust painting, and he said that people don't just put sawdust on a canvas and make it look like that, which was certainly true of something that we found out when we were trying to make our own sawdust paintings. And it took us, I think, 8 tries before we got something that sort of looked like his sawdust painting. My intern, Caroline Hoover, is convinced that he took little tweezers and picked out every single little piece of sawdust that he liked, because we could not get an even surface like his, no matter what we tried.
The mock-up panels were subjected to water damage, and a material called agarose was found to be successful in removing the stains from the sawdust. A gel mixture was carefully cut out to the exact size and shape of the stain in the sawdust panel before it was placed on John's original work.
This tide line here that you see in the photograph, this is before treatment, so you can see how severe that tide line was. That was all along here at the top. So you can see it's significantly improved. Crucifix is a very interesting work of art. When you look closer, you start noticing that the panels are composed of kind of these natural materials like red mud and sawdust and ash, which really start to represent, at least in my eyes, to sort of, the blood of Christ, or to the flesh and ash and death. I think his choice of materials allows the viewer to contemplate tactile nature of kind of these religious themes. And the more time you look kind of at these pristine, often color-filled surfaces or minimal surfaces, you start realizing that they're not minimal at all. They're really complicated. And that commitment to his working method was a really special aspect of John, and I think defines him a lot as a painter.
The style that John worked on at the end of his life was characterized by a repetitive process of painting and sanding. Humility is a painting that is stunning in an uncomfortable way. The canvas is painted a deep blue, and the emergence of the backstretcher from the sanding process is visible, a metaphor for how humility can wear you down to the bone.
He was suffering from depression. He was a loner. He didn't like to have many people around him. When he was depressed, he would say, "Oh, I will not be able to paint anymore." He had also issues with tremors. His hands would tremble, and he would get really, really depressed, thinking he could not paint. And I would say, "Yes, John, I think you can." And I go to France every summer, and I guess he enjoyed listening to my stories, so I said, "You should come with me sometime." He finally said yes. So we flew to Paris. We rented a car in Paris, and that was my first time in my life to drive in Paris, and I was petrified. I can drive anywhere else in France, but Paris I had never done. So just picture me and John as navigator before GPS going through Paris. So we did a lot of U-turns, but we managed to get out of the city. And our first stop was in Chartres. So I could tell that John really enjoyed visiting churches, so we did that. We walked in the cathedral, and John, I could tell John was just, in awe, just really happy to be there, moved. And I found out after, when he returned, that he had found inspiration in Chartres, and I think that gave him courage, the fact that he was able to travel with me, gave him the courage to get back into his painting, and he actually named one of his works that he painted when he returned, Cathedral, and I think it was also inspired by this visit to Chartres.
He came back from that trip and began a style that characterized the last 7 to 8 years of his life, in which he would apply an underlying base color to the canvas and then apply a very rich acrylic and then sand it, and then repeat the sanding and painting over and over again. And then he would etch into the canvas with an awl a very simple organic form. And these works, such as Cotton Bowl and Cathedral, have these very organic shapes. They're very simple, and at the same time, very rich with color and depth. And that was the style he was working on up until the time that he died.
Instead of like many marks, now I'm just making a few lines on a painting, but they are equally obsessed in their simplicity and have the impulse to control, even though they're so thin, these lines. But anyway, it's been an interesting process. I'm sure we'll all change again if I'm so fortunate to grow old. and keep working.
The last paintings that John worked on depict a radio cell tower and a transmission tower. They were portraits of his own mother and father, who once owned a company that built electrical transmission lines and towers. John was returning to his origins through these works. The neuropathy in his fingers made it increasingly difficult for him to work, and as the layers of paint on the canvas hardened, he was no longer able to apply enough pressure with an awl to complete the works.
In some ways, his end of life, when he developed this very serious and aggressive cancer, was something he knew would be coming, and in some ways he had forestalled it for over 20 years. And it was an acceptance that I think he had been preparing for a long time. I remember sitting with him on the bed and him saying to me, "David, I cannot believe I'm going through this." And I said, "Well, I can't either." And he goes, "Who knows what's going to happen, when I die?" And he was saying it in a very curious frame of mind, not a real anxious frame of mind.
I've had a very fortunate life. I've gotten to live in a lot of great places, had a lot of great opportunities come my way. It's almost like someone wrote a book and, I'm just reading it, but so grateful, thankful, full of blessings. Hope everybody's having a good day. And I'm glad I've lived on this earth.
John taught me probably one of the best gifts I've been given. And that's, despite all the things that you have going on in your world, you can always make time for other people. You can always lend a hand to others who are suffering or in need. And he always did that. He was always there for other people.
You meet people like that just very rarely in your life. And maybe some people never do. And I feel like I've been chosen.
I do remember, John's sort of wake or memorial, if you will, at the lake house. David was raising the flag, lowering the flag, whatever, and he was very meticulously doing this thing, just very calmly. And I said, "Wow, you're doing a good job at that, David." He said, "Oh, I have to do this just right, or Gil, as he called him, he wouldn't approve." I was just like, "Oh yeah, you're the younger brother," It's like, he's not the older brother. He's the younger brother. It just always kind of struck me. It was just like, oh my gosh, yeah, John was a teacher for him. We all think, David's this doctor who's gone off to Boston and he's successful and he's doing all this stuff with the art. And it's just like, wow.
Yeah, I think it's well known that Vincent van Gogh had not sold many paintings throughout his life, but what is known and what is evident is the role that Vincent's brother Theo played in establishing his work after his death and really not giving up on an artist that he saw had relevance. So the sense that Theo was still putting Vincent's work out there, putting it in front of people, trying to get it in the hands of specific collections. I think that he could have never dreamed, in the sense that what's happened with Vincent's work has happened and is still happening. But I think the idea that what Theo did for Vincent, David is doing for John, in the purest sense. I mean, you're simply looking after family.
As a psychologist, what I really do is I tell histories, and those histories involve people's lives. So in some ways I was really well equipped to put a narrative on the objects John left behind that are called art, but which I knew very well because I knew John. And I don't know that I've done it the right way or anything, but it makes sense to me. I loved, stories are great. That's what humans are, we're stories. And so it's why we're sitting here talking about this, is we want to capture this story. And really that's what I did with this whole project.
I've become, just more grateful, more amazed and by all the wonder of life and just how precious and fleeting and ethereal it really all is. And maybe that's why I make an object that you can see in the concrete world, and it seems to have some kind of permanence. I create this permanence and I can go on to something else.